Thank you. Finally, I want to honor three of our recently departed soldiers: Ike Tribble of Tampa, Sam Jones of Indianapolis, and Betty Ford of the National Office. They were extraordinary champions of our cause who will be sorely missed. 40 years ago, great men and women came together not in a time of comfort and convenience, but in a time of conflict and controversy. Among them were Whitney Young, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Dorothy Height, along with countless men and women who were of all races, creeds, and religions. They came together to plan and execute the historic 1963 March on Washington. 40 years ago, they came together as champions of a fundamentally American idea that all people are created equal and imbued by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This idea, because of their work, is embedded in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and it is now ingrained in our hearts and in the very DNA of our souls. And it is a living idea. 40 years ago, this National Urban League, with its guild, its affiliates, its organizational expertise, its mosaic of many people, and under the leadership of the late, great Whitney Young, played an integral role in the 1963 March on Washington, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, and the Great Society programs which followed thereafter. 40 years later, we can proudly celebrate the many successes of the Civil Rights Movement. This movement spawned the diversity among corporate executives which we celebrate at this conference. The Civil Rights Movement spawned the new dynamic African-American middle class, which lives in big cities, small cities, edge cities, and suburbs, and who hold investment portfolios that their parents never dreamed of. The Civil Rights Movement has spawned new entrepreneurs who, as Black enterprise proudly touts, have in some cases reshaped the face of American business. 40 years ago, there were no African-American elected officials in the South and almost none in the North. 40 years later, the Civil Rights Movement has spawned a record number of African-American mayors, judges, state legislators, members of Congress, and other elected officials, some of whom are here tonight and which we celebrate tonight. I was one of those young people who was propelled towards elected office because the Civil Rights Movement opened new doors and encouraged new dreams. 40 years ago, we celebrated the Supreme Court, then led by Earl Warren, which was squarely on the side of social justice and equality. 40 years later, as we waited for the Supreme Court's decision in the affirmative action case involving Michigan, we worried that today's Supreme Court would shut the door on the progress begun 40 years ago. But by a one-vote margin, the Supreme Court showed courage and enlightenment and upheld the principles of diversity and affirmative action. I especially applaud those corporate CEOs and retired military leaders who unflinchingly supported affirmative action in Friend of the Court briefs. They joined the National Urban League and other justice groups on the right side in this pivotal case. 40 years later, America is a paradox of progress. While the Civil Rights Movement defeated Jim Crow and Tiger and Venus have become champions, there is still an equality gap in America. There is still an equality gap in America. My friends, there's an equality gap in education. There's an equality gap in income, in wealth, in access to quality health care, and there's an equality gap in home ownership. There's an equality gap between African Americans and white Americans when it comes to participating in the political process. If the 19th century was about a freedom movement to end that peculiar institution known as slavery, and the 20th century was indeed about a civil rights movement to defeat Jim Crow and achieve equal rights and social justice for those who a century ago had been freed from the bondage of slavery, then I say today that this National Urban League movement, with our wonderful mosaic of people, must lead a new movement in America, and that is an empowerment movement. A movement that is much more than ideas and thought, but a movement of action. The movement to close the equality gap is a movement to defeat the brand new villain. That villain is James Crow, Esquire. As Dr. Robert Hill says, James Crow, Esquire represents the new, sometimes not so obvious, structural inequality that persists 40 years later. Tonight, I ask each of you and all of America to join the National Urban League as we launch an empowerment movement to defeat James Crow, Esquire, and to close the equality gap in 5 critical areas: education, the economy, health and quality of life, civic engagement and civil rights, and racial justice. The equality gap vividly demonstrates that contrary to the sometimes superficial appearances and divisive rhetoric, we, America, this nation, this National Urban League, have so much more work to do. The empowerment movement that we must lead will not be televised, and it is not a movement of weapons or war. It is not a movement of hate and division, but it's a new type of movement. It is a movement that commits to action, and the National Urban League must lead this new movement. First, it's empowerment time in education. 50 years, that's right, 50 years after the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka ended segregation in our schools, we are still asking ourselves, why has America not closed the achievement and resource gaps? The gaps that make it more likely for a black child in an urban area to attend an overcrowded and dilapidated school where performance is low and dropout rates are high. We must not be afraid to ask, why are our jailhouses in better physical condition than our schoolhouses? We must ask, why does the rate of incarceration of our black men continue to exceed the rate of college admissions? We must ask, why in the year 2000 were there 13 states in this nation where there were more African Americans in prison than in college? We must not be afraid to say to ourselves that we have much more work to do, and we need a new movement in this nation. To close the equality gap in education, the National Urban League will begin next spring by convening a high-profile national summit on urban education. We will examine where we have come since Brown v. Board, not to be nostalgic, but with an eye towards charting a new course, to close the reading gap, to close the achievement gap, to ensure that every child whether they're from the south side of Chicago.